Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of JWJI and Emory College, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's First Fridays at 4 session. Emory College and JWJI acknowledge the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. In 1821, 15 years before Emory's founding, the Muskogee were forced to relinquish this land. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory seeks to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to the respectful stewardship of the land. Normally, your welcome would come from one of the deans of Emory College. Unfortunately, Associate Dean of Faculty, Develina Roy, was out of town today, but she did record a welcome greeting, so I'm going to play those now.
Hello and welcome to First Fridays at 4. I'm Develina Roy, Senior Associate Dean of Faculty for Emory College of Arts and Sciences. I'm sorry that I can't be with you all in real time today, but I wanted to welcome you all to today's talk and also give you some background for this speaker series. This collaboration between Emory College and the James Weldon Johnson Institute has grown out of numerous conversations in the summer of 2020 as this country has attempted to grapple with our history of racism and our communities have reeled and protested following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and unfortunately several others. One of the many things that makes Emory such an important institution and such a special place in which to work and learn is that our faculty includes some of the nation's leading scholars, artists, and voices on race and social justice. This work has never been more urgent. In the past several years, we have recruited many new faculty, including some who have only just begun to plant their feet on our beautiful campus and are not yet known beyond their own departments. This speaker series, Emory Scholars on Race, has been envisioned as a new monthly ritual to stretch our minds and to enrich the fabric of our community by featuring the scholarship and creative works of our own faculty. And hopefully soon, in our post-pandemic future, we look forward to gathering in person with all of you. I'm pleased to turn the floor over to my colleague, Professor Andra Gillespie, who is the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. Professor Gillespie will introduce our speaker this afternoon. After today's talk, there will be a moderated discussion with a lively Q&A. So please feel free to use the chat function on your screens, and Professor Gillespie will be happy to share your questions with our speaker. Once again, I wish I could be with you in this Zoom room today, but I'm looking forward to watching the recording and seeing you at our next First Fridays at 4. Enjoy.
We're very grateful to Dean Roy for recording that. Today it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Pearl Dowe to you today for today's First Fridays at 4 session. Dr. Pearl Dowe is the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Political Science and African American Studies in both Oxford College and Emory College. Dowe was hired under this unique arrangement in 2019. Her appointment was designed to bridge Oxford and Emory colleges. With a home base for teaching and scholarship at Oxford, Dowe liaises to the Department of African American Studies at Emory College on the Atlanta campus, where she teaches a course each year and helps to expand the curriculum. And at Oxford, her courses in political science and African American Studies have a thematic focus on understanding leadership. Before joining Oxford College, Dowe served as associate professor and department chair in the Department of Political Science at the University of Arkansas. Her most recent research focuses on African American women's political ambition and public leadership. She's the co-author of Remaking the Democratic Party, Lyndon B. Johnson as a Native Son Presidential Candidate, and editor of African Americans in Georgia, A Reflection of Politics and Policy Reflection in the New South. Her journal articles and book chapters have appeared in many places, including the Journal of African American Studies, Political Psychology, Presidential Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Black Studies, and Social Science Quarterly. Dowe also serves the broader political science discipline in many ways. She sits on the editorial boards of the Journal of Economics, Race and Policy, and the Race, Gender, and Class Journal. In addition to this, she happens to be my partner in crime as co-editor of the National Review of Black Politics. Raised in Georgia, Dr. Dowe is a graduate of Savannah State University, holds a master's degree in political science from Georgia Southern University, and earned her PhD in political science from Howard University. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Pearl Dowe.
Thank you, Dr. Gillespie. Thank you, Andra, for this invitation. And so I'm very, very honored to be here with you all today on this Friday afternoon. And so my talk today, I'm going to share my screen. And so my talk today, I am going to speak to you about agency and power, Black women in politics. Particularly, this is very, very significant for me because this is a part of a broader work, which is a book manuscript, which is in current process. I'm actually in the process of revising chapters and finalizing the last 2 chapters of the book. And the book is entitled The Radical Imagination of Black Women, Ambition, Politics, and Power. And so today I'm going to share with you a little bit from the chapter on political socialization, as well as the theoretical framework in which the book is grounded. And so I'll just begin. Politically, 2020 was a historic year. Not only did an unprecedented number of Black women seek political office, they were also at the forefront of voter mobilization efforts and headed up political campaigns. This robust political participation was particularly noteworthy given American society and the body politic's long history of disenfranchising, neglecting, and ostracizing Black women. Speaking on the campaign trail in Iowa while seeking the Democratic nomination for president in 2019, then Senator Kamala Harris stated, "I have faith in the American people to know that we will never be burdened by the assumptions of who can do what based on who has historically done it." The words of then Senator, now Vice President Harris echoes a belief that despite the mistreatment Black women have faced, they hold onto a radical faith that their vision for change through leadership is of value and can be and should be accepted by communities outside of their own. Likewise, the historic number of women who ran in 2018, one of the most radical efforts for change was that of the campaign of Stacey Abrams, who sought to be the first Black woman governor in the nation. Her campaign and political work to address voter suppression was significant in which that it was symbolic of not only a personal ambition to win an election, but there was also a desire to address and advance the interests and the needs of the communities in which she was seeking to serve. Abrams is not an anomaly. Along with other women such as Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, Mary Church Terrell, Ella Baker, Joanne Robinson, Shirley Chisholm, and Barbara Jordan, and so many more, she stands in a long line of Black women who dared to use their bodies, their minds, their talents to oppose violence, discriminatory laws, social norms and culture, and the possibility of death, not only to make their voices heard, but to elevate the standing of Black women in the Black community. Patricia Hill Collins refers to this as a culture of resistance, and it formed a legacy of struggle for family and community and an ethic of caring. These women and countless others envision and still envision a more just world in which their resistance matters and benefits both those who look like them and society as a whole. This type of social vision is what I refer to as a radical imagination that propels ambitious Black women in the face of adversity and marginalization to translate their vision of justice, equality, access, and freedom into social action. Black women's radical imagination convinces them that individually and collectively, they can change a world that tells them that they are less than. I'm working with 2 screens here. And so a quote that symbolizes very profoundly to me what the radical imagination is by Ella Baker. This may only be a dream of mine, but I think I can make it real. And so I offer that this radical imagination is activated through the tangible work of networks, of local organizations, political mobilization, and the action of seeking office. Black women have long understood that political engagement enhances their lives and the lives of the community members that they seek to serve. In spite of marginalization that they face, this marginalization that is evident when we look at pay discrimination, sexism, public shaming, and isolation, Black women use political engagement strategically to undermine this marginalization by sustaining ambition and fostering a socialization process that simultaneously encourages independence and collective identity through families, organizations, and religious institutions. This process has long nurtured and developed a leadership cadre of Black women who uplift not only their communities, but themselves. Shirley Chisholm exemplified this radical imagination when she reflected on her 1972 campaign for president. In her biography, when she discussed her decision-making process in deciding to run, she said, and I quote, "If I decided to run, I could serve to give a voice to the people the major candidates were ignoring as usual. Although I could not win, I still might help all the people who were offering me support by increasing their influence on the decision about who would be the Democrat nominee." That did not seem an impossible goal, difficult, but not impossible. Although Chisholm did not win the nomination, her vision for her campaign also exemplified how the radical imagination of Black women also takes shapes once the Black woman is elected to office. And so this is my theoretical intervention. I refer to it as ambition on the margins, in which one, we have this radical imagination, which has a vision for freedom, justice, equality, and access. And then that helps to shape this ambition. And ambition, as I'm defining it, it looks different than just the idea that I want to run for something. That is a part of the ambition, but it's also about what is it that you're going to do once you are in office. And that also shapes whether you actually move through the political chain. One of the things about ambition theory, typically or historically, has been that we look at political ambition based on a hierarchy. You are a city council person, so naturally you're going to become the mayor, then you'll run for the state legislature and so forth and so on. But with ambition, Black women are looking at their position very differently and making decisions whether to stay and in some cases leave. And so this ambition is shaped by how Black women are socialized. It is shaped by their racial and gendered identity, as well as the networks that they have access to within their communities. Ambition also serves the purpose of responding to marginalization, as well as marginalization can also shape ambition. So it can hinder ambition as well. So that's also a factor here. But a marginalization that Black women are addressing and being impacted by is coming from these stereotypes and othering that occurs, political parties, and the marginalization from parties in the sense that parties do not often see Black women as viable candidates, so therefore they're not recruited, as well as images within the media, and then attitudes and stereotypes that come from potential voters. I use this theory as a way to explore why Black women decide to run for office and engage politically, and also what resources they have at their disposal once they decide to run. Much of the recent work on political ambition of women concentrates on white women, and it often negates the lens through which Black women view themselves, namely their own political agency and how they navigate political choices, opportunities, and obstacles. By exploring not only the motivations of these women, but also the resources available to them, I'm advancing the existing literature and demonstrate how Black female elites maintain their community-based interests even as they ascend to power. The radical imagination of Black women, it fuels, as I said, it's fueling this ambition and it's empowering them to engage. And this, as unfortunately, is often misunderstood. often because Black women's ambition, it is not individual, it is communal, and so therefore it has been ignored and considered non-existent. And in many cases, Black women have been considered to be less ambitious than white women and Black men and white men as well. This limited perspective prompts a series of questions. What marks the path to Black women's political ambition? A path, I argue, that is not only an attainment of office, but also a desire to serve. What does a Black woman's leadership development looks like if she endeavors to serve in political leadership roles in a long-term capacity? How can she prepare to meet and overcome the social, racial, and gendered barriers that historically have affected Black women's representation so negatively in state and national political leadership? And so central to my argument is the socialization process of Black women. And in political ambition work theory, particularly early on when this theory was evolving in the 70s, a lot of the work really centered around the fact that there was a career path that allowed people to be socialized into politics. Typically, business leaders and legal people working in the legal profession, men, most of the time, that they were able to be socialized to engage in politics because they would have access to particular resources. As a result of this idea, this helped to explain at that time why women were not considered ambitious, because many women were not a part of those type of career paths, particularly Black women. However, what I'm arguing is that socialization, particularly political socialization for Black women, looks different, and that those career paths are not necessarily the paths that Black women have to have to enter into the profession, into politics. And so when we look at the socialization process of Black women, there is a home socialization of Black women in which Black women are more likely to be head of household. Black women are more likely to go to work earlier in their lives and stay in the workforce longer. And this labor has created an autonomy and independence within the Black community and in their homes that white women, their white counterparts, did not have. And so as a result of that, it leads to a different viewpoint and a different type of social capital that Black women have. There's also this communal socialization, and a lot of the recent literature, particularly on Black girlhood studies, have really emphasized, and motherhood, and recent books on Black motherhood really have emphasized the value that Black women are giving, imparting to their children, their daughters, particularly in how to respond to racism and sexism. And this comes from messages of stating that there is a need to be independent. There is a need to pursue excellence, and that there's a need to also serve and be a role model. And then there's the political socialization piece that I've already talked about, that as a result of this, that there is this understanding that politics and civic engagement is important, and that it has a value, and not just only value to the individual woman, but also to the community overall. And so how does this socialization play out when we actually see the process of making the decision to run? So Tashara Jones, and I love this picture, I think this is a very beautiful picture of her. She is the mayor of St. Louis. I interviewed her when she was still the treasurer of St. Louis. And she said to me, Black women run to do something, men run to be somebody. And I just thought that was a very profound statement. And when she said it, I said, that's in the book. I said, that's probably a chapter by itself, because it was so profound when she said it. And this something that she's talking about, it is something that in political science and social sciences, Holloway Sparks referred to in 1997 as a dissident type of citizenship, meaning that marginalized people oftentimes find alternative spaces for engagement, that they are finding spaces to actually agitate. They're finding spaces to do the work that they cannot necessarily do in more traditional ways. So this something is this work that helps to develop communities that many don't see or even understand. And it has a purpose. And so this dissident citizenship and this something that Tashara Jones talks about is one of the things that I see as redefining how we talk about candidate emergence in political science. This candidate emergence theory that we often talk about, as I said, it tends to be this hierarchical type of process. What I'm arguing also, particularly looking at Black women, is that it is not just this point A to point B to point C decision-making process, but that it is this ongoing cycle that is shaped by this imagination and shaped by this overall holistic community and this identity that Black women have. And so there is this agency and action that Black women have, this desire to elevate their standing within the community and to bring the community along. That leads to this dissident citizenship, meaning that they're developing, cultivating these different spaces to actually engage in politics and to discuss issues and to find ways to actually strategize to impact change. This, as a result of that type of work that we often see, and it comes many times also through volunteer and community work, often opens up the opportunity for alternative type of spaces for recruitment and provide resources for campaign success. One of the things that I found in the research and talking with the women, it was that, yes, consistent with the literature, many of them were not recruited to run for office by someone who was within a political party or someone who was a politician. Some of them were, but many of them were not. They oftentimes were recruited by community members who saw the work and value that they had. And so this recruitment came from different spaces, but then also the resources that they needed to run for office came from the different spaces. So for example, one woman I interviewed, a city council person, she was a small business owner. She owned a small magazine, which really came out like every other month, and she highlighted local businesses and what was happening in her community. And she ran into this man she was in a public place, like in a store, and she had already announced that she was going to run. And he said, I know you. And she said, yeah, she's thinking that he knows her from the campaign. And he said, you helped my son. And he went on to tell her about how when she volunteered at an event, she helped his son. And he said, yeah, I know you're running. I haven't seen any signs. And she said, well, I'm getting ready to get signs made in a few weeks. And he said, no, don't do that. He said, here's my Staples card. We're going to go get your signs made today. And so there was a lot of these examples of these resources coming in to these women based on the work and the reputation that they had established. So these alternative spaces that filled the gap of what was not happening from the more traditional models that we would expect to provide political resources. So let's get into some of these quotes and some of the things that the women informed me about. So this chapter that I'm talking from, I interviewed 32 women across the country, from as far as Alaska to New Hampshire. I covered all the regions, and this included U.S. Senator, not former Senator Harris, but Carol Moseley Braun, state legislators, city council persons, city treasurers, as well as school board members. All of the women were on the record. They all reviewed the transcripts, gave me permission twice to use their names. And so I definitely wanted to make sure that I had their consent and about what I could use in the interview. And so you'll see the actual names. There will not be any pseudonyms in this book. Also, I interviewed Black women who were part of party politics, serving as vice chairs within their states, and campaign staffers. I interviewed the national president, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, which is one of the largest organizations of Black women, as well as I have a little data in this chapter from focus groups where I held focus group of 40 Black female college students at 3 different campuses across the country. And so after I went through, did all these interviews and began to code, there were some themes that came across that I wanted to share with you. Like what we know in the literature, there were women who were reluctant to run. There also were women who were very excited to run. But there was some that were extremely very hesitant, in which they had to be asked multiple times before running. The things that they took into consideration oftentimes was who were they going to run with. Several of the women stated that they were concerned about the fact that they were possibly going to run against white men who were going to be had access to more money and were better known than them. They also were concerned about the impact on their families. They were also concerned about the financial aspect. All of these women that I interviewed had careers going into politics. None of them were stay at home or had the leisure of not having to work. They all had full-time careers. Some of them were divorced, some of them were single, some of them had children, but the full swath of life, but they all were considering, what does this do to my personal life, my time? But what was also interesting was that several of the women talked about how they saw themselves as not having anything to contribute. As I mentioned earlier, part of the literature tells us that because of how politics has been very male oriented, a lot of women didn't see other women running for office. So they thought that because they didn't see it, therefore they themselves was not qualified. They were not qualified to do it. And so Meredith Lawson Rowe, who's a member of the Reynoldsburg City Council, which is a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, she was asked numerous times to run. She was close friends to a city council member who was actually getting ready to transition off, and the city council member wanted her to run for her seat. And she felt, as she said, I didn't have the experience, I didn't have the education. And she's college educated, and she still felt that she was undereducated to run for a city council seat. She said she didn't have the political background. She felt she had to come from a certain type of family. And so she's telling this person all these reasons, and the person had to pretty much go line by line and say, no, this is what you can do. This is what you have. You can do this. And what Ms. Lawson Rowe informed me of was that it wasn't until she began to reflect on what she had done outside of her career. She was an executive administrative assistant, but she had an extensive amount of community service. And she began to think about the fact that she knew how to fundraise. She had fundraised in some organizations that she was in. She was a member of a sorority, and so she knew how to put together an agenda. She knew how to present. She knew all these things that she had learned, these tangible skills that she had learned in volunteer work. She began to realize that she could apply that if she were elected. And so, but it took her a significant amount of contemplation and prodding from others for her to make that leap. Another theme that was consistent was volunteerism. Now, a lot of literature on Black women in politics, it tells us that Black women engage at very high rates in community service work, and that possibly gives a network. And the women that I interviewed, that was very consistent. I could write probably 2 chapters just listing all the work that these women had done prior to running for office. But there was also a unique strand of political volunteer work that these women were doing. Many of the women, in addition to civic volunteer work, also had done political volunteer work. Many of them had worked on campaigns of friends. Some of them had unique skill sets in which one person was an accountant. There was another person who was considered to be highly organized. And so they were pulled in by friends to say, hey, can you organize this? Can you put a spreadsheet together for this? And after doing that, they began to help other people do campaigns. Some of them became so involved that they actually became like consultants in their community after working on campaigns over a period of time. So this was something that was unique that I found. Also, several of them became engaged in politics as a result of issues. So Sarah Anthony, who is in the Michigan House of Representatives, some of you may know Sarah Anthony. If you remember from a few years ago when Michigan, the legislature was threatened by white supremacists, there was a picture that went viral of a Black woman entering the legislature um, um, with armed guards. That was Sarah Anthony. And so when I interviewed her, she talked about coming home from college and graduate school, and she wanted to get involved because the issue at the time was affirmative action, the affirmative action lawsuit against the University of Michigan, and how that was also going to impact affirmative action within the state and state hiring. And so that was the first issue that she was really engaged in. And she entered by working on campaigns to address affirmative action. And then she worked on a Friends congressional campaign. But what she learned while she was working on those campaigns was the fact that she said that she thought that the table, meaning where the decisions were being made, that people were not being adequately represented, particularly low income folks and Black and brown folks, that their issues were just not being uplifted with fidelity. So she also had observed that there were people who lacked integrity and that they were not being the most honest or diligent about some of these policies, and these plans that were being talked about, particularly around affirmative action and who it would impact within the state. And through the process, I was able to gain a lot of inroads into communities that ultimately helped me when I started to put my name on the ballot. And so as she was working on these issues, she began to develop a network that allowed for people to know her once she actually decided to run for office. So she was one of those people that was not extremely hesitant in running for office. She actually looked forward to it and actually said that there was aspects of it that she actually enjoyed. Also, the Barack Obama campaigns played a critical role for several of the women, particularly the older women that I interviewed. There were several women who were planning on retiring. They had no intention of going into politics. And one of them was Charlotte DeLorenzo, who is in the New Hampshire State House Representative. And she stated that she had no interest in politics. It wasn't until 2007 when she saw Barack Obama give a speech and she began to volunteer in New Hampshire. And then she volunteered again for his reelection campaign. And after the reelection, there were conversations about the fact that in New Hampshire, that there were not a lot of Democratic offices, particularly in some of the smaller towns. And as a result of that, she became a part of the group that opened the first Democratic office in her town, and she became the vice chair. And from that, she then moved on and actually to elected position. And so the socialization process of learning campaigns, learning issues, and not just only learning campaigns and issues, but also understanding at a deeper level the impact that these issues have on constituencies that these women are interested in serving for. Another theme was, again, with the socialization piece, was the socialization that I mentioned earlier around the community socialization about excellence. Many of these women talked about having a work ethic to work well, to do more, but they also talked about how they had a work ethic about what it was that they were doing in the moment, whether it was the career or whether it was actually their elected position, that they valued what they were doing. Senator Carol Moseley Braun, in her reflection about what motivated her to enter politics and just her long career, she talked about her parents. Her father introduced her to politics, but her mother, who did not engage in politics at all, gave her work ethic. And she said that in every position that she was in, even when she was going through law school, she wanted to do the best job that she could. And she often heard her mother's voice when she became frustrated. And her mother would tell her, do the best job you can where you're planted. And that was my motivation, to do the best job and to put one foot in front of the next. And then when it came time, she was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, which eventually led to her cultivating networking and moving, campaigning and running for the US Senate. Also, as a result of this, we see with this socialization that these women not only had this work ethic, but they understood the barriers that they faced as Black women campaigning. What was an interesting fact in looking at the women that I interviewed, many of them were not in communities that were majority Black. Many of them were in very, very diverse communities in which the majority population sometimes was Asian, sometimes it was Latino. And so many of these women realized that they needed their community, but they also needed to reach out to other people if they were going to win. And so Shawnette Strickland, who also was in Reynoldsburg, she said that if we only need 1,500 votes, you better get 2,500 to understand you got to work differently. You got to fundraise differently. You have to have your message different if you got to knock on those doors. So many of these women talked about that they were not going to be outworked, that they were going to knock the doors, they were going to have a message, that they were going to out hustle whoever they had to, because they understood that they may be at a disadvantage, particularly if they were in communities where they were running against someone who may have been more high profile or had more fundraising opportunities than they did. Another thing that was consistent was all the women talked about a seat at the table and what that seat at the table meant for them. And for Brenda Gilmore, who is a Tennessee state senator, she talked about the value of the seat at the table, and that not only did it allow for her to have a role in the legislature, but that she could also help people in her community, and that she enjoyed that just as much as in sponsoring a bill. She talked a lot about advocating for children and parents when they had issues, that parents would call her, particularly when they were dealing with situations where their child had been overly disciplined in school. She talked about, in this quote, advocating on behalf of a child who had been suspended and was told that he could not graduate and walk with his class. And then she took much joy in working with the principal and the superintendent and the mom and dad. And so she found value in doing that type of work. And she understood that had she not engaged in those conversations, that student possibly would not have been able to actually graduate with his class. And so we see that this seat at the table means something much more than just making a legislative decision. Also, one of the things that was a theme, and I asked all the women in one of my final questions with them, was about the next steps. Where do they see their political career going? And Judge Sheila Calloway, who is in Tennessee, she stated that she had not completed all the work that she wanted to do as a juvenile judge, but that she had a bigger vision, that she wanted to impact policy that dealt with young people and how to develop strategies to keep children and young people out of an adult system when something occurred. And so she wanted to be a part of the decision-making process. And Judge Calloway, like many of the women in their conversations with me, they spoke of, I guess the best way to put it, a transformational type of leadership, that they did not want to be transactional, that they really wanted to actually transform policies and outcomes. And so Judge Calloway, we spoke extensively about this, how challenging it was for her, that when she had to deal with a young person, that trying to find alternatives, but it was oftentimes dependent on the resources. So if she wanted to send a child to a particular home, it was depending if the home had space, or depending on what the child was brought in to her for, depending on what the child was charged with, there were restrictions based on the law. And so she really was committed to trying to find different ways to keep children out of adult jails, because in many cases, unfortunately, she had to sometimes place children in adult jails as a result of the restrictions of what was happening in Nashville and in Tennessee. And so I'm going to stop there. And so I will conclude, and there's a lot more that I could have shared from this chapter, which we'll probably talk about in a few minutes. But what I will say is that in looking at these women, and particularly in looking at the socialization process and looking at ambition, that I think it's very important that we have this conversation to really understand how and why Black women run, but also we have to not only understand how and why, but I think it's also important that we understand that this is possibly a model for other women who are also attempting to seek office. So that will, let me go ahead and stop my share here.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dowe, for this.
I'm going to step up and turn and pull this blind really quickly.
Sure. So the next section that we're going to be in is a period of moderated questions between me and Dr. Dowe. So I have about 5 questions to ask. And while we're doing that, if you have any questions, please feel free to include them in the Q&A section, which should be at the bottom center of your screen. And I will be happy to read those questions to Dr. Dowe. So my first question for you, Pearl, is what motivated you to do this project and to take this research agenda on?
Well, it's been a long time. I started thinking about Black women in politics after tenure. So I was tenured, so it was 2014. And I remember reading, and one day, this was in the spring, I remember reading 2 articles, 2 separate news outlets that talked about white women politicians in the South, that they were going to help Democrats flip Southern legislators. And so I read these articles and I'm like, I don't think that's the case. And so studying politics broadly and Black politics, I knew that Black women were more successful in running and winning those type of seats and understanding the dynamics of the South. And it was like, okay, why do people think this? And why are we dismissing Black women as viable candidates? And so that started the thought process for me. And I had several ideas about what I thought the book was going to be. I thought it was going to be looking at how Black women saw other Black women as leaders. I thought it was going to be just on why Black women run. And then I was like, I got stuck. I was in my head and I got stuck one day. And it was just about maybe 3 years ago. I had this aha moment where I realized the factors that contribute to Black women winning also were the factors that contributed to them running. And when that came to my mind, I was like, okay, now I got something. And so I can move forward. And so, but it was just really just to kind of dispel, what the idea that Black women couldn't win and that they were not viable candidates that really started this.
Right. Well, related to that, can you tell me who you're in dialogue with intellectually? I read your work and I see places where you could be in dialogue with Nadia Brown at Georgetown. There are other places where I see perhaps Jennifer Lawless at the University of Virginia, and Richard Fox. But who do you consider yourself in dialogue to, and how are you pushing back and actually adding to the research that already exists on women in politics and on Black women in politics in general?
So it's funny you mentioned Lawless and Fox, because I'm curious as how, when this comes out, how Jennifer Lawless is going to what she's going to say, because it doesn't push back against some of the work that she's done, because a lot of the work on ambition has been the survey data that is largely focused on white women. And coming at this work, I realized that the surveys could not give us what we wanted, what I needed to know. I do have survey data that looks at Black women public opinion broadly, but what I really want to know about how these women were coming to the decision, that was not going to be a survey. So I am pushing back and extending and saying that your model is really not applicable to the women that are really winning, and particularly winning on the local level. The women that I'm in dialogue with, as you mentioned, Nadia Brown, Wendy Smoot, who really began this conversation really with her dissertation on Black women in legislatures. Really looking at, and then also extension, we have so many women we don't talk about, like the women who taught us, May King, who taught me at Howard, and Linda Faye Williams, who taught Wendy at Maryland. These women really, and Jewel Prestige, who taught so many of our colleagues around the country, they really laid the foundation in talking about Black women, that there was something unique about this experience that Black women had, and that it was a political experience, and that it had value. And so, yes, those also Christina Burano, who focuses on Latinas in politics. We have some overlap there, so we're in conversation as well. And we're actually, I think, all are going to be in a publication soon, where we kind of in dialogue about some of these issues about women in politics, particularly women of color in politics.
Great, thanks. Well, why should we care about Black women's political ambition?
Well, it's funny you asked that question, because I started thinking about it, and I think as a Black woman, I care. But I think for a broader model, with some of the things that the women shared with me, right now, there's two things that I will focus on. One, there's this effort this idea, if we train women, that they will run for office. If we can train them, so you have Emerge and you have all these other groups that are coming out, women organizations that are targeting Black women, Higher Heights, and all of these women, all these groups. And if that is the model that we're going to use, then you have to understand what these women are bringing to the table. So we can't have these training programs with the assumption that they have nothing to bring to the table. And you have to, I think, so understanding the resources and the socialization process that someone is bringing with them, and why they think the way they think, why they're viewing these issues the way they're viewing these issues, is important if we're going to say that training is important. Because I believe training is important, but it's how you're training, because some of these women talked about some of these training programs, and that some were beneficial, some were not beneficial. And it oftentimes because they felt like this program had a model that did not include me. Also, I think it's important because, as I concluded, I think Black women, they're the model. And I think that because if we look demographically, we're in this demographic shift nationally. But I think if we look at what's happening with white women, so in political science, as you know, Andra, we check boxes, right? And so we've always said, to run for office, you have to have this, you have to have that, or to vote, you have to have this. And so for Black people have always exceeded that. Black people are like, no, I don't have any money, no, I have this, but I'm gonna stand in line all day and I'm gonna vote, right? And political science always try to figure out, why do Black people do this? And so here it is with Black women, not checking these boxes, but they're running for office and they're winning. With white women, we're starting to see a demographic shift, in the sense that more and more of them are not married, or they're marrying later, similar to Black women. More and more of them are in family structures where they may be single mothers. More and more of them are in communities where more women have higher education than men. More and more of them are in careers where they are reaching glass ceilings. And so there's some parity that I think that we're starting to see. And I'm not negating that they're not the same, particularly when we look at privileges and that, but just some of the dynamics of how we study women, and the issues that white women are going to have, Black women have already overcome in many cases. And so this is the model, I think, of how do you develop community outreach. Because one of the unique things about Black women as candidates is that, and I kind of briefly mentioned this, that contributes to their success, is that they have this ability to be very transparent about who they are, and they bring their full selves. So if you look at a lot of the campaign ads for the last few years of Black women, they just put it out there. They're like, I was unemployed, or I had a full-time job, but I had limited health care and my child was sick. How did I, so health is an issue. I'm a full-time nurse and this is what I saw. I'm a community activist, and they're bringing these full experiences, and it's not only attracting Black voters, but it's also pulling in other voters who can relate to their experiences. And so I think it's a very, very important campaign strategy about how do you present yourself. Whereas for years, we've told women and people of color, don't be yourself, right? To be deracialized, to degender yourself. But here, these women are saying, no, this is who I am. And I can win with this. I don't have to hide. And who I am is not only beneficial to me, but it can be a benefit to you because I have a unique understanding and a unique empathy that you may find of value, and that can be beneficial when it comes to policy implementation and policy making.
Thank you for that. Well, as you were mentioning some of these successful candidates, we also know that not every candidate wins, and no model is going to sort of predict or even make a claim that there's a 100% surefire way to get elected or to keep getting re-elected. So how do you interpret the challenges facing Black women political elected officials today? So I was thinking about this week just because I happened to hear her on TV. But thinking about former mayors or soon to be former mayors like Stephanie Rawlings Blake of Baltimore, or our own Keisha Lance Bottoms, or even thinking about Kim Janey, who was interim mayor of Boston, but she didn't even get enough votes to make it into what amounted to the runoff election for mayor a week and a half ago in that particular city. How does your model explain hardship and even failure in some cases?
Well, it's something that I probably need to think about, and I'm glad you mentioned that question. I think that speaks to the marginalization piece and how these women approach these issues. One of the things that the women often talked about was understanding the pressures of what they were doing. And so I'm thinking particularly about when Keisha Lance Bottoms announced that she was not running. And I remember just trying to read everything, be like, why, what was going on? And I remember hearing her interview on the radio, and I think Keisha Lance Bottoms is one of the most profound people in an interview. She gives she always gives you something you're like, wow, I didn't expect for a politician to say that. And I remember just listening. I wasn't watching, I'm glad I was listening instead of watching her. And I remember just hearing her in this extensive interview just talk about the challenges of this moment. And it felt like she was saying, I have agency. I don't have to do this anymore. So this is part of that agency that I think Black women are expressing, that I have options, that I want to serve, but this is not the only way to serve. And in this phase of my life, this may not be the best way for me to serve. And so I think that agency, is coming into play when we see women choosing. And then also the marginalization piece, I'm thinking about the mayor, soon to be former mayor of Charlottesville, who made the decision as a result of the challenges of being a Black woman in that very white community, that she decided not to run again. And again, that agency to protect yourself, whether it is you're in a hostile situation or you're in a situation where, like Mayor Bottoms said, at this point, this is not, the best way for me to serve anymore. So I think that's part of it. But I also think that we also have to be mindful of how difficult these positions are. One of the things that my next project is going to be about the women who lose, particularly looking at this last election cycle where we saw a snippet of a Black woman raise a lot of money, right? We've always said it was money. It was money, money, money. And there were Black women in 2020 who raised money but still didn't win. And so I think we have to look at this hyper-partisan climate that we're in, this hyper racially hostile climate that we're in, and how does that impact, and what are the new variables that have to be in play for these women to overcome if you have the money, if you have the name recognition, you still can't win. And then now that we're in this round of redistricting, what is that going to do? So I think my next project is going to be looking at how do Black women overcome these obstacles, which are now becoming even more entrenched and I think even more rigid and difficult to overcome.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking of old work by Robert Smith on Black women's political ambition. And I think you're thinking about it a lot differently than we have before. So my final question, and I see questions already in the Q&A, so I look forward to reading those to you, is what kind of profile do you expect Black women to have in politics 5 to 10 years from now?
I think we're going to see a more a broader profile. So I think traditionally, historically, we've seen the elite Black women politicians, so particularly the women, many women that I'm talking to fit that profile. But I think we're going to see, and we may have to redefine what elite means. Andra, that's your next project, right? In the sense that I think we're going to see Black women that are coming from a much broader background, not so much this traditional middle class background, that are engaging in politics. I think we're going to see a lot of the women who consider themselves to be activists, particularly like a Cori Bush. I think we'll see more Cori Bushes, women who don't have that straight path of politics, engaging. I think we're definitely going to see younger. And so that was one of the things that the demographics of even my group, that there was a significant younger. And they also are not following the path. They're going into the top level as far as running. They're not going, I'm going to run for mayor first. No, they're going straight for the state legislative position, or they're going straight for this congressional seat. So I think we're going to see more women seek statewide positions, who may be running for the first time. So I think we're going to see some differences there, but I do think we're going to see a broader demographic of women, beyond just the stereotypical Black middle-class woman who often has ran for office.
Great. Well, thank you for this. So an anonymous attendee asked, and perhaps you could, if you put the chapter, the title of your book project in the chat so that we can share that with everyone. This person definitely wants to cite it in their master's thesis, so we're happy to accommodate that. Amani Barnes asks, I truly appreciate this forum. I'm a 14-year employee at Emory, and I'm also running to be the first Black to run for the Tucker City Council. I made the runoffs, and I'm looking for advice to keep going when it's hard to. They down my education and say I'm not experienced in politics. I will not quit, though. And Amani notes that they were 60 votes away from their competition.
I will say this, congratulations to you. I would say your experience is not dissimilar from other women, particularly some of the women I interviewed here in the local area. I interviewed several of the women in Rockdale County and Newton County, and they had very similar experiences in which they were considered to be outsiders because they were not considered to be as educated, or they were not a part of the in crowd. And they won. Those women won. And so I will say that you can win, you can find a path to victory. And so that's the first thing that I will say. I think that as far as finding encouragement, I'm not sure when your election is coming up, but I would say if you can find and connect with the other women in the area who are on local city councils, that they probably can offer you some definite tidbits, because like I said, your story, as Andra was reading it, sounded very similar to some of the testimonials that I heard about, particularly the first time candidates for city council, that sense of isolation. And also these close elections, and these local elections are very close because unfortunately we have very low turnout in elections, particularly in off presidential years. And so that's another issue that needs to be addressed about motivating people to run, not only run, but to vote, because these local elections have a significant impact on our communities.
Thank you. Daryl Pone references the role of women in politics, particularly their role as mothers. So how do Black women leverage their role as mothers to give them additional experience and additional credibility when addressing political issues?
I think the role of mothers really was important. Looking at the women in my sample, many of them that was the entree into politics. Many of them were concerned about what was happening in their schools, and so that's how they got involved. Whether it was through engaging, going to school board meetings, or even a collective group of mothers who supported students at the football game. That they formed these networks of trying to figure out what was happening in school. So being a mother definitely informed their sense of concern, and it gave them a sense of, I guess, a push to actually put their foot, to actually run for office, because they really felt invested as a result of their children. Also, one of the things about the mothers was that they had a concern about the time. That was something as well that we have to talk about what it means to actually have these roles, as well as maintain your family balance. And so a lot of the women put off running for office. There were several who put off, that they knew they wanted to do it, but they put it off until their children were a certain age. So children and mothering really was a important factor. But mothering, and particularly some of the work on mothering, I'm thinking about Rashay Barnes' work on mothering, in which a lot of the things she found in interviewing mothers, and she did her work here in Atlanta, the sentiments about mothering and community was very similar to what I found as far as the socialization process. So the messages that they were conveying to their children about service and what they wanted to, what the world that they wanted to give their children, right? That their actions and as far as being mothers, what they put their children in, what they exposed their children to, what they protected their children from, was very consistent to what I'm talking about, this radical imagination. That these women and Black women as mothers, that it is about building a world. It's really about building a world, whether it is through what you impart with your children or what you're going to do as an elected official. There was a lot of overlap, I would think, particularly what I know of some of the motherhood literature and how these women approach politics as well.
Right, thanks. So Amani typed in that the runoff election is November 30th, as it is here in Atlanta. So please don't forget to vote. The next question is from Lauren Benton. I am really looking forward to buying and reading your book when it comes out. While the South has large groups and concentrations of Black folks in rural and big city areas, this is not always the case in other parts of the country. How do you see geography influencing Black women's decisions to run and their likelihood of winning?
That is so interesting you mentioned that, because I'm thinking about the women I interviewed in Ohio. So the Reynoldsburg, Ohio, those women I interviewed, they ran as a slate. It was 3 Black women, they ran together as a slate. That community is largely Bhutanese and Nepali, and so it is very, very diverse and not a very, very large Black population. There was also a woman I interviewed who was in Des Moines, Iowa. I interviewed a woman who was in Alaska. And so these women were finding success in communities where there were not large Black populations. They were Black communities, but they were very small. They were not enough that could carry an election. And so that also contributed to what I talked about, that work ethic, that they understood that they would have to carry their message very broadly. And then they also did a lot of networking. Many of the women talked about networking and utilizing their networks to do the work for them, right? To allow them to enter into certain spaces, particularly spaces that may have been closed off. So they talked about being very strategic. And we don't talk about Black women often as strategy, but they talked a lot about using these networks that they had through work or through service that allowed them entree to actually talk to key persons in some of these communities that they had never had access to. But I think one of the things that the women did, and this is what I was mentioning with that we know about strategy, and this is kind of what our colleague Tasha Philpott in her article talked about with Black women, is that Black women tend to be successful, even more successful with diverse groups than white women because of these experiences and because of how they approach politics, because they are bridging gender, they're bridging race, and many also in some of these communities, some of the women that I interviewed, and even some of the women that I didn't interview, but I wanted to interview them, many of them had, they were multi-ethnic, right? They were Black Latinas. I'm thinking of several that I didn't get a chance to interview. And so because we're seeing a much more diverse population, we're also going to see a much more diverse type of candidate ethnicity, how they're identifying. And so I think that Black women have to strategize, and they can strategize and they can be successful. And like I said, several of the women I interviewed coming from communities that were very small Black populations. And that's also one of the things that some of the more recent literature is showing us, even with the congressional races, some of the last, these congressional races that Black women have won, some of the most recent women entering Congress, they came from districts that were not majority Black. So this idea that you have to have a Black district to win, many of these women are winning also congressional seats in these type of districts.
And so Lauren actually writes in Lauren Underwood as an example. And so when you
Lauren Underwood,
yeah, the nursing I knew I figured
Delaware, Val
Yep.
Deming's seat, all of these are not majority Black districts. And even Val Deming's seat is really a very affluent type of seat, right? So that's a very unique district as well for Black women have won it.
Yeah. Alex Bolton asks, did you find any differences across parties and or ideological factions within parties in terms of the consideration of Black women candidates and potential candidates when deciding to run?
Well, it's interesting because I do have two Republicans that I interviewed, and the Black women tend to run as Democrats. So the majority of the women that I found to interview were Democrats. I reached out to as many Republicans as I could find, current, serving, and past. They didn't respond. But the two that I did interview, it was interesting. One of them actually was a Republican because she had to be. She was in Pennsylvania, and the municipality that she was in, the Republicans ran the municipality. So she's like, if you're going to run, you have to be Republican. And so I asked her, I said, well, if you run for the state seat, what are you going to do? And she's like, well, I'm kind of, I don't know, because she said I'm Republican, and in some ways I'm not Republican. But to your point about the difference in the party, so what we're seeing with women running within the Republican Party, they tend to be, we're seeing an increasing number of women, but still not to the level that Democrats are running women. So there is a gap there. We saw just last week, is last week, Andra, is a week, 2 weeks now?
Week and a half.
Where Virginia elected a Black woman as lieutenant governor, in which they had a choice between two women of color. And so I think when we see this, this is a question, right? Particularly women of color in the Republican Party, are there opportunities for them? One of the things I remember when I first started talking about this to some people, someone asked me, said, well, should Black women just run as Republicans? They may get some more support from Republicans because they don't have enough women to run. And I said, that could be an option. But then looking at party, politics, and particularly the women I interviewed, and talking about some of the issues that they were concerned about from an ideological standpoint, they did not align with the Republican Party. But overall, I think both parties have had challenges in running women and seeing women as viable candidates. And women have had challenges in both parties, fundraising, getting support. And oftentimes support in both parties tend to come, particularly we're talking about state seats and congressional seats, when the woman has won the primary. So oftentimes the woman finds herself, since she's as a first-time candidate, pretty much on her own, unless she has an established track record and is considered to be the party candidate. But if she's not in that party loop, she oftentimes does not get party support until she can prove herself and win a primary. And sometimes many women in both parties tend to somewhat go it alone until they can win that primary.
And within the Democratic Party, I think part of Alex's question was also, are there differences in terms of ambition or how ambition gets expressed between progressive Black women versus more moderate Black women?
You know, it was looking at the women who would be considered progressive in my study, it was very similar. That was one of the things that was interesting to me. And as I'm thinking about the last chapter, writing the conclusion of the book, and I was reading some of the transcripts a few days ago, just the similarities across the spectrum, which was, I was thinking I would see some differences, particularly differences in even the position, the state legislature versus school board. And the experiences were very, very consistent. Where there were differences with the party dynamic, it was dependent on the party structure within the state. That was really what made a difference. So there were a few women where there was a highly structured Democratic Party in the state, and also that trickled down to the local level, and those women received some support. But pretty much outside of those were outliers. Many of these women did not have party support, and even many of them. Several of them, and I had to go back and really ask them, is this on the record? And they gave very, very detailed examples of how the party threw them under the bus. And even once they were in the legislative body, how they were thrown under the bus. And so these women are having some very, very challenging experiences within the Democratic Party. But there are some, like I said, there are some that, depending on the state structure, they were able to tap into those networks. And that was largely because of what they had done before they ran. And they had a little name recognition. But for the most part, I comfortably can say the majority of the women that I interviewed, they received little support from the party until they won their primary.
Thanks. Kes Robinson asks, how do you see Republican-led redistricting impacting Black female candidates?
It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge because what we're seeing and looking at, some of the lines here in Georgia and even in other states, many of these women are going to be drawn out of their districts or even pitted against a fellow Democrat or a Black Democrat. So I think it's going to be extremely challenging, particularly in this hyper-partisan climate. And I think that's what we have to begin to look at this. This is a very, very different political climate than we've seen as far as the partisanship and the racial vitriol that is a part of the conversation, the political conversation. And so I think once you add that to the fact that you now have a line that you've been drawn out of, that makes it extremely challenging. And my dissertation years ago was about Black candidates running for election when their lines have been redrawn and how do they win. Well, that was in 2003. So politics in Georgia is very, very different. And I looked at Sanford Bishop and Cynthia McKinney because their lines had been redrawn and they both won in new lines. It's a totally different world as far as what a woman has as an obstacle, Black woman has an obstacle, particularly going into a redrawn district. So I'm not going to say they can't win, but I think it's going to be extreme challenge, particularly with fundraising, because they're going to have to raise even more money to try to fight off all the particularly Republicans that will possibly run against them to get those seats.
Well, thank you for a wonderful talk and answering such wide-ranging questions. I'll do a last call for questions. If you have questions, please feel free to add those to the chat. And then seeing none, I do want to highlight our next First Friday's talk. So it will be on December 3rd at our regular sort of date at the first Friday of the month at 4 o'clock. This talk will be by Dr. Callie Gross, who is a professor in African American Studies. Her title is called Maria 1681. And in this talk, Dr. Gross is going to be discussing her historical research and current book project on Black women and capital punishment. She will map historical disparities, touch upon research challenges, and explore the need for histories on difficult subjects. So I hope that you will be able to join us then. It looks like we have one more question. An anonymous attendee is asking, are you considering running for office?
No, that is not, that has never been my thing. I will help somebody, but but no, I have no desire to run.
Well, again, thank you so much for giving this talk and for sharing your wisdom with us today. We are really appreciative of it. I want to thank the audience for being here. I hope you have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you at our colloquium on Monday or at our next First Friday's event, which will be on December 3rd. Thanks again. Take care.